Hello, everybody, and by everybody I mean 45 people who are waiting in the waiting room. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes, as we normally do, to get going. And in the meantime, feel free, as we do a lot. Put where you're. See, Melanie beat me to it. Castle
Already on
Rock,
it.
Colorado. Yeah, put where you're from, just for fun. Also kills time, and it's cool to see the representation, usually international too, and with Adam Price, a speaker that's international. So awesome. And excuse my clutter. Maybe you can't see the boxes. There's Fraud Fight Club stuff back there, but also I'd like to point out that the speaker's nice suit jacket, nicely combed hair, and then you have this. So it's fitting though. They're gonna say all the smart things. I'm just gonna pass things off. So um, all right, getting up closer to 100 people. Awesome. Go Birds. Thank you. Yeah, I sorry guys if you hate the Eagles or Philadelphia. It's not fun with webinars because it's a lot of the clothes I wear are those things. So
I'm excited to see all the representation from Texas this morning. Yeah, El
yeah,
Paso, Houston, a couple of Austin folks, including myself. So it's nice.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then all the Texas people, there's got to be a Cowboys fan in there somewhere who's like, ugh, what is this guy doing to me? All right, we are 2 minutes past. Let's get rocking and rolling here. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining our webinar, Deepfakes, Fake Candidates, and Hiring Fraud, Securing the Modern Onboarding Process. Um, Before we get started, a lot of you guys know we do housekeeping items. It's mainly just about the questions and comments. You're right there in the chat. That is exactly where they go. I will try and keep up with, sometimes there's floods of questions, sometimes it's we can get to them at the end. But I like to ask them in context to what's being discussed. It usually goes better that way, but I'll get to as many as I can. And that's really it as far as housekeeping. Let's get right into intros of speakers. My name is PJ Rojo. I'll moderate today's session, co-founder of About Fraud. We also do some conferences, Fraud Fight Club, and a new one this year called Merchant Fraud Alliance. So excited for all of those things. But let's go to the stars of the show. And Adam, and we have two Adams. So I will say their last name or their last initial. So let's start with Adam Price, if you could do an intro.
Yeah, hi PJ, hi everybody. Great to be here. Thank you so much to invite for inviting me. So my name is Adam Price, and as you may have guessed from my accent, I'm based out of the UK, but I work for the company you see here behind me, Ping Identity. So I've been with the company for over 5 years, and I'm the director of product and solution marketing, dealing with all things to do with financial services in particular. So that's me.
Fantastic. And Adam Basia.
Indeed. So, on top of having the similar last name, similar suit jackets, and hair, I am also in product marketing. So, I work at Mitek, as you can see on the throw pillows on the couch there. But I run product marketing at Mitek, which is an identity and access management company. Or, I'm sorry, it's funny. I'm thinking I am because of Adam. An identity verification company along with biometrics. So, yeah, that's me.
Awesome. No, these guys, in the prep call, we have some great stuff to share, but they also are equally passionate about this, as this is going to be a really good conversation. So I'm excited for the attendees to hear from it, but also jump in that conversation. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So just kind of framing the session, and then we'll kind of get into what you guys think. We've spent many years securing customer onboarding for a variety of products and accounts and lines of credit. I think this is a particularly interesting conversation because we're focusing on hiring, which seems to be a newer entry point into systems, data, and infrastructure. You add in the remote, the digital component of hiring, and there's probably somewhat of a trust gap there. So that's where the conversation gets interesting with the intersection of IDV and IAM. and why these two companies and people are perfect to talk about it. So I'll start with Adam Basia. Can you give us a little introduction of what that Venn diagram looks like to you of IDV and IAM?
Yeah, of course, and really like a lot of sort of what you mentioned, but so in the case of identity document verification, IDV, right? The focus has long been on consumers, right? The end users are the business's customers and who they really are. So for IDV, that could have been when someone came into a bank branch or applied for a new wireless line at AT&T or Verizon. But obviously, for many years now, it's also been very much focused on digital consumers, people that are online and not present during, that information presentation. On the other hand, identity and access management, IAM, at least before the explosion of CIAM, was focused primarily on workforce access. Where in that case, the end users that they're worried about are the people that are employed by the business. Well, to your point earlier, right now that there's been this massive rise of remote workforces, IAM is equally focused on that same problem. How do you trust someone that you don't know when they're not in person? And also, how do you continually manage access for individuals that are well outside of that corporate firewall? And frankly, that is exactly why Ping and Mitek are working so closely together, right? Like we're partnered up to secure that full identity lifecycle from initial verification to ongoing authentication and access management, and the goal being to help organizations establish trust with their employees, even when they're in a bunch of different area codes or time zones, like most of us are these days, right? So if Mitek can help keep the bad actors from getting through the front door, it makes it much easier for Ping to help manage their access once they're on board.
Yeah, um, really well put. And sorry, I saw somebody raise their hand. Feel free to fire that comment or question, whatever you have in the chat.
Mm.
But that makes a ton of sense. And I think it's as we look at the attack surface, it becomes even more relevant. So Adam Price, I guess what factors have enhanced that attack surface when it comes to hiring, at least?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, good question, PJ. I think Adam, you've hit the nail on the head on a couple of notes there. I mean, ultimately, enterprise hiring now at global level is not happening in person, right? For it to happen at scale, it has to happen remotely. And there may be touch points in that hiring process that are done in person, but the reality is that most of it is done remotely. I mean, I remember 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, I was hired into Fort Rock, now part of Ping. I was all done remotely. Like nobody ever met me. There was no verification of any sort, and I got the job. So that's kind of one reason. I guess another reasons here is that as large enterprises have become more interdependent, they've become more reliant on using nearshore and offshore capabilities. So again, it's not viable to fly those candidates into locations and interview them, particularly if you're doing that in an agile way and you need to onboard and offboard workers. But also, there's a very important reason in addition to that. So as we know, all malicious actors, whether they're state actors, whether they're rogue crime syndicates, they always follow the path of least resistance. And the reality is that the hiring process was never really modernized in any way, right? The onboarding process. Most enterprises thought, we'll do what we've got. It's fine. It will do. But the
Yeah.
reality is that, those malicious actors have found vulnerabilities and obviously they target the path of least resistance. And so they've now developed, in this day and age, industrialized tool sets to go and exploit those vulnerabilities and to find the blind spots. And it's really interesting because the advent of Gen AI and now agentic AI helps to automate the process of finding the blind spots. So this is no longer an option; it's a must-have. But I think there's another factor here in play as well, and I think Adam, you and I talked about this in the tee up to this great webinar, and that's the fact that workforce access and indeed third-party access in most enterprises, even in regulated industries, is grossly over-provisioned. Right?
Mm.
I
Yes.
came across a stat 2 years ago that suggested that an average worker in financial services globally has access to over 1 million files. Like, why? That's not acceptable, right? So
Yeah.
you couple that together and you create a kind of a storm that it needs to be addressed. But yeah, Adam, what your thoughts on that one?
No, I mean exactly to your point, right? That that path of least resistance is something that we've seen in fraud, regardless of what industry you're talking about, what part of the business you're looking at. They will always go look for the weaknesses. And when you talk about the onboarding process and the hiring, and it's funny because you mentioned, you know, hiring offshore, right? You think about the interview process too. It's never, okay, well, I'm interviewing with one guy. You're going to interview with two, three people. It's going to take a couple of weeks. You're not going to fly them back and forth 14 times. So it absolutely becomes this thing where they're expected to trust the person on the other end just based on, I don't know, their LinkedIn profile or something like that. And then when you talk about over provisioning of access, right? Once somebody gets into the system, once they're in and once they start having that massive proliferation of access, then it's much, much harder to root them out or get them out of the system. So it really makes that front door process the point of entry, the real weak link in the process.
Yeah. Um, Really good. And there was a question about, are we talking about the Indeeds and LinkedIn's of the world? I mean, that's a channel, but I mean, everyone's hiring. There's internal teams, there's external teams, there's recruiters, there's job boards, probably a better word for that. But so yes, but well beyond, I guess would be my answer to that. If you guys have anything to add on, feel free. But um I think so. Let's talk stats. Adam, sticking with you, Adam Price. I know there's tons of stats supporting, some of the challenges you've kind of alluded to and explained in the hiring fraud landscape. Can you just share some compelling ones that kind of drill down on the problem we're dealing with?
Yeah, 100%. And look, PJ, you're on a call of two marketers, right? So, like, we love our stats, right, Adam? So, there's a ton to
Absolutely.
share.
Yes.
Look, I've got one here that's really compelling, right? So, we've had over 300 US companies infiltrated by North Korean linked remote IT worker fraud.
Yeah.
300. That's just one country as the victim and one country as the perpetrator. And that's generated over $17 million in illicit revenue. And that's not a stat pull out of thin air. That's from the US DOJ, 2004. And what's really interesting as well, when you think about the infrastructure that's put in place to manage that, one of the things that is really, really critical to facilitate remote hiring fraud is laptop farming, right? Laptop
Yes.
farming. And it's very interesting that one particular stat is underpinned by laptop farms that span 16 different countries. So there's an infrastructure across multiple jurisdictions that is having successful impact in really compromising the hiring process.
Facilitating it. And I'll throw one in just on that exact point, which is not so much a stat, but just as a fact, right? Both the FBI and DOJ here in the US, they've issued formal warnings to US corporations. I mean, this is like a year and a half ago for Russia, for China, for Malaysia, and for North Korea. So you're quoting North Korea, which is probably one of the biggest and most prolific state actors out there right now. But also Russia, China, Malaysia. I mean, like if you think of the scale of one being, that financial stat that you quoted, and then knowing that there are multiple other huge countries doing the same thing, like it's terrifying to think of how large that problem actually is versus what we even see on the surface.
Yeah, 100%. And the other thing before we kind of jumped on this webinar, we were talking about a really interesting clip, 60 Minutes Australia, where they were actually trying to expose that, looking at it from an Australian perspective. If the audience gets an opportunity to get that, watch that, it's available on YouTube, please do. Because what's really interesting, this is not just about compromising the remote hiring process, but it's also about generating an income. So that
Yeah.
income that you as an employee would get then flies to those malicious actors, and furthermore, their access enables them to purchase illicit arms and illicit technologies that we know a country like North Korea is under embargo, right? So
Right.
this is used in a layered way to create additional security risks, not just for corporations, but for state actors as well. So it's pretty scary stuff, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that's funny, I mean, I think they even mentioned it in that 60 Minutes piece, but you've heard this before, is some of these actors, to your point, they're actually just there to collect paychecks, right? That it's revenue generation for that nation state, and they will work for years, and they do good work. And when they catch these people sometimes and out them, the company will be like, "You can't fire that guy. That's literally my best employee," and that's because it's like 10 guys behind the one guy that are all doing the coding and stuff.
Yeah.
But but at the end of the day, right? Like it's still illegal revenue generated for that company. And the other piece of it, you talked about the ability to buy things on behalf of, but there's also, they will sabotage systems and create, security backdoors that they don't plan to exploit for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months down the road, right? So you've got something in your code from 2 years ago that you didn't even know was there that's a security exploit for that nation state if they decide at some point to use it. But it's not an instantaneous thing. So they are playing the long game as well.
100%. And on top of that, then we'll throw the situation that we're in with adversarial AI, right? And again,
Mhm.
there's another stat here. Apparently, AI-driven impersonation has grown by a magnitude of, and I'm not misquoting this, between 300 and 3,000%, right? So you think about the age that we live in, it's just so much easier to spoof and to fake identities, which kind of, gets into this whole mantra about why verified trust is really important. Like, we cannot trust anybody in a recruitment process until they're verified. We cannot
Right.
trust them once they're been, onboarded into the system until they've been verified. Now, we at Ping
Yeah.
Identity are very strong on this kind of notion of verified trust, and it's really, really fundamental to ensuring that that individual can actually be verified at each stage of the journey to the appropriate level of assurance, depending on the kind of function that they're performing. And in some cases, these are not, back office jobs. In some cases, these are mission critical jobs that enable those actors to have access to mission critical infrastructure. I mean, it's pretty
Yeah.
scary, right?
Yeah. I will throw one stat in because I did pull one up that I found really interesting. This is from April of last year, I think. So there was a Gartner emerging technology trends note that was really based on mitigating candidate fraud through identity verification, and it estimated that 1 in 4 job candidates will be faked by the year 2028. Now that was, and again, that's 25%, which is terrifying. But that was April of last year, and I'm willing to bet if they had to put their finger in the wind and guess again this year, it'd probably be even higher than that because to your point, right? Generative AI has made this so much easier for just average person to do. So sometimes it is these malicious state actors. Other times it is just somebody who's wildly underqualified for that job. Sometimes it's somebody who just,
Yeah.
is just trying to get through the front door because they just are trying to get a job. But you still can't trust that person and their credentials without doing some sort of verification.
Yeah, the range of this is, I was talking with some of our coaches, just experienced fraud fighters in financial services, and they could tell the person was typing into ChatGPT the interview questions as they were interviewing them. So that's innocent when compared to, North Korea infiltrating X, Y, and Z, but it's that person's never getting hired. That person you don't want in the front door. And if you can't tell that, it's just a big range, right? Of abuse and all the way to clear fraud and really, really severe consequences. Which makes me happy as about fraud that we have a small team and don't really hire many people because it's a tough process, and we're not here to scare folks too much. We're going to get into eventually, what can be done about this. But I think knowing the magnitude of the problem is super important. So, um, Adam Basia, let's start with you on this one. And so IAM assumptions. There's some IAM assumptions that I think get folks into a bit of hot water as it relates to hiring fraud. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and it's funny. I'm actually thrilled that you started with me on this because my background before this was at SailPoint, and this kind of takes me back to my days at SailPoint when I was doing IAM. The reality at that point, and it's still sort of true, right? Is when it comes to managing provisioning and deprovisioning, it's typically based off of the information in a system of record, right? That like a lot of times that's Active Directory. Well, that system itself, that works perfectly, but it's based on the notion that every employee in that system is who they say they are. And that, right, that's the assumptive problem, that the identity is real at enrollment. And so I think, if you were going to ask me sort of where one of the big problems is or those assumptions, I think one of the big issues is that like IT and HR don't always coordinate and collaborate, right? Like IT is just this single step in the onboarding process. So if HR says, "Hey, send this guy a laptop and make sure he gets access to X, Y, and Z systems," that's what they'll do. But like who actually verified that that applicant was real, or that the person who the laptop is being sent to is really the same person, right? Because Adam Price was talking about laptop farms. You'll get somebody that gets laptops from 20 different companies, turns them on in the morning, goes and has their coffee, and lets, North Korea or whatever nation state log into that laptop remotely and work off of it. So IP addresses, geolocation, that stuff doesn't work because, yeah, it looks like this person or the laptop itself is sitting in Utah, but it's being worked on or worked through by somebody in, a completely different location. And ultimately what that comes down to, right? Like if you think about it, companies have spent decades and decades building very strong controls around access, but much less time thinking about the controls to confirm who they're actually giving that access to. And that's the biggest assumptive challenge, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
um, yeah, you guys can keep going. I was going to go
no,
to Melanie's
I was gonna add to that. I mean, that's it. Like, and I think Adam, you hit the nail on the head earlier on when you said, identity verification used to, be, and IAM used to be kind of primarily focused on the SIAM explosion. Previously, kind of, emerged from a workforce space, but actually, when you think about identifying that and verifying that individual, that's one thing. But then that's not just an authentication event. And the reality is that in an IAM stack, you've got a whole plethora of capabilities like fine-grained authorization, policy-based access, access
Mhm.
journey orchestration, verified credentials. All these things work towards actually providing a high level of assurance, right?
Yeah.
It's not just
Yeah.
about a login event anymore, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Melanie, I think, has a great question. Have y'all, ooh, y'all, maybe from the South as well, like me, worked with any HRIS recruiting system vendors to build in technology in their platforms? Or are we talking about a solution outside of our HR systems? And she verified South Carolina too. So, um,
Yeah.
yeah, whoever wants to jump in there.
Well, I'll just say, the overall workflow for onboarding, right? Like if you think about the current workflow for onboarding, most of the times there's a step function in there where they go check your credentials or they do something else to verify, like, hey, we're going to run a credit check on this person or we're going to run a background check on this person, those types of things. So this is that same process, right? There should be something in the workflow that becomes an identity verification. We're going to do something where we absolutely confirm that not only is the identity that we're looking at a real identity, but the person that is holding it is the same person, right? I'm talking to the same person. And where it really gets outside of the HR system and really I think a little more towards IT is okay, and then when we send you that laptop, we're confirming that the address is the same address that was on that government issued ID that we verified in the first place. Is this really going to your house or are you sending it to somebody else? And then from there, which is, the identity verification portion, then we hand off to, the folks at Ping and say, okay, and now what are we doing each time there's an authentication into a system that needs additional step-up authentication or something that, has access to privileged information, those types of things. Like how are we overall controlling access once somebody's within the front door?
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. And I think just to add to the question as well that was raised, like so from an IAM perspective, the historical pattern has been that IAM has been owned within IT departments or IAM departments, right? And then over time, the Chief Information Security Officer, or the CISO, got ownership of that, right? It became a security discipline. What
Mhm.
you've seen over the last 4 or 5 years as identity, broadly speaking, has become a what I call a strategic asset, is you've seen that purple up or bubble up to board level, right? And so it's not just the CISO who's involved in that decision making, or the CIO, or director of IT, or the director of IM. It's actually the plethora of the C-suite that's involved in that, and that includes HR and personnel as well. So I wouldn't say necessarily these solutions are built just for managing access for the workers, but third party consumers,
Mhm.
contractors, and now agentic AI as well. That's an
Yeah.
enterprise level motion that requires that board level visibility, right?
Yeah. And and
Yeah.
and I love, and I just gotta say, like the agentic AI one is one of those things that like that could lead to an entire other, webinar for us. Like, how do you manage access and privilege for bots that are acting on behalf of someone? Because for so many years in the security space, we've treated bots as 100% bad. If you see a bot, it's doing something malicious, it's a terrible thing. But now everybody's got these friendly little agents that are doing lots of things on their behalf and working for them. So how do you make sure that agent is only accessing the systems it's supposed to, that it's only doing the motions that it's supposed to. So it is a whole additional level of security risk that in the industry we now have to contend with.
100%. Agentic AI can get annoying as a buzzword, but it's such a shift
Really?
in not just financial services, just society as we function. And no matter what you're doing, people will take advantage of that and exploit that. And bots are our friends in some cases, the good bots, and differentiating it is where we need to kind of dive more into. But I want to stick with you, Adam Basia, on this, just diving deeper into the problem, then we'll get to what the heck to do about it. Can you share some examples of how attackers exploit today's systems?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, there are a myriad of techniques. I mean, I'm going to assume almost everyone here has seen at least like one video in their LinkedIn feed of someone using a video face morph during an interview. And by the way, if you haven't, you should go look them up because it's actually really funny when they get outed. But the scary part is the speed with which this technology is advancing, right? Deepfakes in particular. You see advice like, "Hey, ask the candidate to hold three fingers in front of their face." Well, that only works like for a little while because the second that someone points out that one of these deepfake engines can't do something very well, the makers of those products like Magic Cam and others, they go work on fixing that bug because to them it's a bug. And within a couple of months, right, that's no longer a tripwire. Just here at Mitek, like I've been on Zoom calls with our own R&D teams, and I've watched them switch seamlessly between their own faces, celebrities, our CEO, even on a couple of occasions to my face, which is extremely unnerving, by the way. That technology in particular has really changed it. The ability to do real-time face morphing makes that interview process done via Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever much more dangerous. And then the other advancement that I think is sort of changing the game. We talked about generative AI, but generative AI being used for synthetic identities. There is so much, unfortunately, like real PII that's available, like all of our information that's out there that you can very easily assume the persona of someone else, right? And for a few bucks, go generate an ID based on that information, just with like a different face on the doc, like my face, right? So okay, like as an example, let's say that I apply for a job using Adam P's name and resume, right? Which is not hard for me to go pull off of LinkedIn. I can pretend to be him during the job interview process, right? And if they don't necessarily can't tell the difference because hey, great hair, maybe like not quite as young as he used to look, but okay. Um, you know, right? Like then when they go to run that traditional background check or that credit check, everything is going to check out, right? And then I can have them send me my new company laptop to any address I want. And I mean that's not really that scary for product marketing jobs like Adam and I have. But again, if you're talking about a senior software engineer that's going to be coding on your backend platform, or you're talking about a finance person that's going to have access to your company's accounting information, that is a much bigger risk. So those two things, I think, deep fakes and Gen AI being used for synthetic identities has really sort of changed how vigilant you have to be in the hiring process.
And that point there about, depending on the job role, right? Let's think about privilege access, right? Because last time I checked, most privilege access management solutions still vault credentials, right? And those
Yes.
credentials are just moved around, but they're still available. So, when we think about how do we not just onboard it, but then bring somebody, sorry, not just hire them, but then onboard them, privileged access users need to have just-in-time access, right? We'll need to move away from being reliant on credentials and move towards delegated entitlements and use things like, TPM chips on phones to provide device assurance. So when you get to the privileged access piece, it's a whole new different world about how to hire and onboard those individuals as well, right? And the level of assurance is much higher in those particular use cases.
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. All really good stuff. And you mentioned your hair, both your hair. I'm jealous of both of them. So, getting into uh solutions, right? Like we spent the first half hour on the problem, which is important to understand the magnitude of it, but I think a lot of you would like to know how can, you be helped in defending against these. So, I'm going to start with Adam Basia, and Adam Price will get to you as part of this journey. So, Adam, so I know Mitek, is well known for high assurance identity proofing and onboarding, but how does that come into play when developing trust in the identity before IAM?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it probably sound a little bit of a broken record here, but it all comes down to trust, right? What we talked about. These attacks, they work because organizations trust identities, and I say identities, right? Too early in the hiring process, right? Like just like a bank would never let someone open a credit card account without first thoroughly confirming their identity, businesses need to first thoroughly confirm an applicant's real world identity before they even begin thinking about giving them access to corporate systems, right? And frankly, like the IDV process is that portion that needs to come into every hiring process. But to your point about then once it gets to IM, I mean, like I'm sure Adam P can talk about dynamic access control and how companies should use the principle of least privilege, right? When you're actually giving access to those corporate systems. So, Adam?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, tee me up there. Well, very, very well, Adam. I mean, look, it's ultimately, from my perspective, it's about knowing what the journey is, the hiring journey, the onboarding journey, and having a clear understanding of what level of assurance is required. And level of assurance is in turn the function of the level of risk that's exposed. Like a privileged user is going to have a different level of risk when it comes to hiring and onboarding than a non-privileged user, right? So once you really understand that, it's about knowing what levels of assurance are required. IDV is a very important part of that function. And on top of that, you also have to use things like context-based signals and policy-based access control and fine-grained authorization, right, to give you, in combination, those delegated entitlements. But then, to what extent can you also trust the device? Can you trust the device? So again, identity verification checks frequently use things like biometrics to get liveness detection to ensure that actually your image is not being spoofed. Then you need to have device level assurance, which uses in some cases the TPM on the mobile phone itself and this kind of secure enclave to provide that hardcore device assurance. And then in other cases also, you need to be able to understand the context. Like, is the IP that particular user is dialing in from, is that legitimate? He said he's dialing in from California, but his IP is showing North Korea, right?
Yeah, and the time of day is really out of whack for
Right.
California. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. And so when you bring that all together, the challenge then is how do you orchestrate that into an access journey? How do you take those IDV assurance points? How do you take those delegated entitlement points? And how do you then orchestrate a journey? And so this is really where identity orchestration or IAM orchestration plays a huge role because it connects that to be able to drive that kind of real-time access decisioning in that stage of the journey. But look, I think the other thing as well that I think is rearing its head, particularly in financial services, and we're working with banking clients who are looking at that space as well, is the use of verified credentials and wallet-based decentralized identity to actually
Right.
issue somebody who's joining that process, that the hiring process, a verified credential at each step of the hiring and onboarding journey. And that verified credential is not the same. And in order for that verified credential to be proved as legitimate, it's got to be identity verified, right? So you've got to have an
Right.
IDV check on that.
Yeah.
It then is sent to you, it goes to your wallet, and the relying party can actually be assured that who you claim to be is actually true. So there's
Right.
a whole plethora of capabilities then. And then once the individual gets the job and gets onboarded, like how do you manage least privilege access? And then Adam, your previous world, identity governance and administration, right? How do you manage that entire kind of IGA cycle as well? There's a lot in play here, right?
Yeah, and we're talking solutions. So one thing I'll add because you brought up biometrics, and I think it's a really valid point, right? Like they've become a great way to do step up authentication without adding like additional friction. If you did a full IDV on that employee during the hiring process, why not use that same biometric template as a step-up authentication method if and when they go to access a sensitive system or take an action like trying to download or move proprietary data, right? Like there's a really easy way to have that be in the workflow that you talked about where, okay, now just really fast, we're going to have you do a quick selfie so that we can do a biometric compare before we let you access that system with all of our customer data in it. So I think biometrics are another way to do it without a lot of additional friction, which is again, it's part of the same workflow. You can get that template during onboarding, during the IDV process, and you can use it again later. And the other thing I'll mention, because man, this is cool, and I hadn't thought about it. You and I hadn't talked about it, and it makes me really like. I love when I talk to smart people in the industry, right? We always think about digital credentials as being something issued by a government entity or some other regulated body. But at the end of the day, a company can actually generate their own verified credential if they want to and put it into a digital wallet or put it as part of that person's verified credentials so that they have to use that credential whenever they're accessing corporate systems. That way, yeah, and the best thing about those credentials, right, is like it doesn't have to give you access to my medical history or my date of birth or anything else. It's just a separate credential that the system looks for before you access a particular system. So companies should consider, like, do we want to actually have credentials that we issue ourselves, digital credentials for our employees, tokens, things like that. So
And Adam, that's already happening. Like in the banking space, customers are saying, "Hey, sign me up. How do I do this?"
yeah.
I've seen this work and play elsewhere, and it's actually frictionless. So long as the candidate has the ability to, have an interoperable digital wallet, they can accept that credential, and so long as they can carry out the IDV check at the appropriate stage, it's a really neat solution. And actually, I think it's probably going to become more of a standard play, I would say, particularly at a more regulated, high level, big enterprise level.
I agree.
Yeah. Awesome points by both of you guys. And kind of understanding who are more likely to be victims of this, getting to Scott's question, agreeing on the access control is key, especially in remote settings. And it's been the case for companies to be secure. But his question is it primarily smaller, fast-growing firms with mostly remote, non-office employees that are most common victims of these identity faking applicant scams?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, it's the same thing with commerce, right? Like if you look at when somebody walks into a bank to open a credit card account or something like that, they're going to have a really convincing ID. They're going to have to be comfortable with going on camera and possibly having their face filmed and all of these things because you walked into the building. But once, the digital movement happened and everything became sort of remote, it got a lot harder to prove who somebody was because they're not going to be in person. Well, the exact same thing is now true for employees. If you've got an office building, everyone's coming into that office building every single day. The person came in and did their entire interview process in that building. You've met them 4 or 5 times. It's probably a lot less likely that they're from North Korea and that they flew over for the entire interview process and all of that kind of stuff. But it is very much these, to your point, Scott, about fast growing firms that are trying to hire talent very quickly in a global environment where they don't necessarily ever meet that person in person. I can tell you from my standpoint, every single person that is on my team that reports to me is in a different time zone, is a different zip code. I mean, one of them's in the UK. So like I know one of the guys on my team, I didn't meet him until 8 months after he had been hired, like meet him in person. We've been on several Zoom calls, but I had never actually met him in person for like he had been working for us for 8 months. So it's really just about how distributed and remote is your workforce. That's really where this problem has bubbled up. And COVID particularly made this a problem for every company. Like there's almost nobody that doesn't have some level of remote workforce.
And I would
Yeah.
say as well, like when you think about this is like not just like a first and second party problem, not even a third or fourth party problem, but an nth party problem. Because you have like you look at financial services again, I come back to this because that's my playground. And you look at the average banking ecosystem and how many suppliers there are in that ecosystem. You know, providers of software, of services, managed providers, the whole gamut, right? So you don't, in order to get to that big banking provider, you could just find a smaller provider, like a small MSP that's delivering a discrete service. If you compromise that entry point, you sure
Mm.
as hell can get your access to the wider ecosystem. So whilst yes, maybe low-hanging fruit at the big enterprises, they also spend more money on working with Mitek and Ping to secure themselves. But what
Right.
about the suppliers that are completely off the shelf? Like I think that's the next romping ground in this space as well.
Great
Yeah.
point. Great.
Good points. And funny, quick story is my co-founder Ronald is German. But we didn't meet in person. because we just had this side project on the side until our first fraud fight club. That was like 5 years after kind of starting the whole thing. So it's one of those things that it's, from side passion projects that turn into full-time jobs to everything, right? Like it's you don't know the person and what type of trust are you willing to put into it. And then when if you have a business and there's lots on the line, you should probably get to know this person in person. But it's just interesting as you know all the different business structures, all the different, it's not just massive companies that need to look out for these types of things. So I want to get into one other section, but PEM, I believe is how you say this. And this doesn't involve hiring, but other sensitive financial transactions. But he's saying we get a great deal of resistance from clients in using the appropriate high assurance IDV instead of OTP via SMS. Is that a common obstacle to getting companies to use appropriate protection? I guess that resistance from clients in what he's talking about.
So I'm going to give a very quick answer, and then I will stop being the one that keeps starting the questions off. I feel like I'm
All
bogarting
good.
everything. But what I will say is, when you say IDV in that question, right, the IDV process is meant to have friction to it. There are points in any process where friction is appropriate. There are other ways to do that step up and have a similar level of assurance that don't provide the same amount of friction. And that's what I was talking about with biometric authentication. If you've done the full friction filled, if it needs to be, IDV process up front, you can create a biometric template when they do that identity verification. I have to take a selfie and compare it to the portrait that's on the document. You create a biometric template of that person's face. Well, you can store that for later and use it for authentication. So instead of sending an OTP, which is very much, like there's a bit more friction. It takes longer because you have to get it and then you have to look at it and then you have to type it into something and whatever. And then obviously it can, man in the middle, get hacked and those types of things. If you do a biometric, okay, hey, this is the part where we want you to step up, and it's just take a quick selfie. That moves much faster. There's not friction. It's not a full IDV process. They don't have to get out their document. They don't have to take pictures of a bunch of things. It's just a quick selfie. But you get that same level of assurance because you're tying it back to the verified identity that you had during the entire IDV process. So, and I don't think anyone, I mean, I hope at this point in time is uncomfortable with using a selfie to gain access to something, right? Like every single one of us probably does it for our phones. If you use Microsoft Hello on your work laptop already, you're literally already doing it. I mean, that is one of the ways that you can sort of circumvent the friction of a full IDV, but still get that level of assurance.
Yeah, and, SMS OTP, let me just say it loud and clear. It is not safe. End of. Like, stop using SMS OTP to do secure things. Like, and it's also, I would say as well, a question of the use case, right? And like I'm going to be a bit British here. I'd say like in the UK we've got payment rails, and I have to do a step up or strong customer authentication as per regulations when I'm transacting a certain amount. I fly to the US and I buy a flight for $900. This one click touch. Like, hey,
Yeah.
what's going on?
Yeah.
So let's come back to this. If you're doing something that requires a high level of assurance, I, as a consumer, expect friction. If I don't get friction, I'm going to freak out. And guess what? I'm going to go and bank with someone else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's about appropriate friction at the appropriate time and the appropriate use case. Sure as
Yes.
hell as an SMS OTP. Sorry, I'll say it once again. This is where IDV becomes so important, right?
Yeah.
And the question then becomes like, how do you enroll? How do you make that as seamless as you can? Like, how can you then use that template, as you said, Adam, to carry out that check later in your journey, right? But SMS OTP is not the way of doing it. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I was going to be cheeky just a little bit. I couldn't help myself when you're talking about how OTPs aren't secure. I was like, yeah, but how do you feel about passwords? How do you feel about username and passwords as a security measure? Because because
It's a
really
spectrum.
OTP, yeah, OTP is just a tiny step above that. It's you still entered your name and password, and then we sent you an OTP. Oh, okay. Well, I'm sure that password hasn't been compromised. Like, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. It's a journey of security, with passwords being the absolute bottom of the barrel. So speaking of journeys, let's talk about the application journey. So I think it's helpful to look at kind of where risk exists at each stage. So let's start with Adam Price. If you can walk us through that, but also going to be interested what Adam Bassi has to say after that.
Well, I kind of already kind of touched on this, PJ, earlier on, right? I mean, clearly, when you are in the remote hiring process, there's no verification that you do. Like in the UK, if I'm applying for a job remotely, I guess I get asked to send like a photograph of my passport. Like, first of all, I don't feel secure about sharing my PII with somebody that may or may not give me a job, right? And secondly, like I can doctor that image very easily if I wanted to, just using Gen AI, right? Not to say that I'm a malicious actor because I'm not, but you get the point, right? So this is exactly where verified credentials and wallet-based technologies come in, and they come in play and in concert with identity verification, right? If I can attest that my identity is true, and then the IDV check can check my liveness detection. It can check that I'm actually, who I claim to be against, a document, a source of trust, whatever that might be in that particular case. Then I get that credential. I don't have to share an image of my passport, and also the party at the other end, the employer, can have a high level of assurance that my identity is actually legitimate, right? And it can also mean that we're effectively then mitigating. I mean, in security, never say never, right? You can't fully remove the risk and the attack vector, but you're significantly mitigating the degree to which malicious parties can spoof that process through, through impersonation and AI generated imaging, right? So, uh, yeah, I don't know, Adam, if you
Yeah,
have any
yeah,
thoughts.
yeah.
Yeah.
Feel free to chime in. Other Adam.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna, I mean, because I think the question as you framed it, was around like the different stages of the hiring process. And I think, right, that interview stage is still probably the strongest opportunity to set up good defenses, right? Like at least for things like deepfakes and synthetics, like Adam was talking about, right? And also, because we were talking about friction in the interview process is okay, right? Like we're talking about people that are seeking out jobs, so they're going to be willing to accept some level of friction on the front end of that process. And let's be honest, right? Like a good real candidate isn't going to bulk at going through verification, because if they got the job, that business is going to need all of their personal information anyway. Do you do it before they ever take the first interview? Probably not. But do you do it by the time they've gone two or three interviews in and you're going, yeah, this is one of my top two or three candidates. This is somebody that I might want to run a background check on. But before I run that background check, you know what? Let me run an IDV and make sure that I have been talking to the right person, at least in my, initial interview, the screening, and maybe one of the first interviews. And then the other big inflection point, if we're talking stages of the hiring process, right? It is the onboarding stage, right? Like proof of address is another part of the identity verification process that we've been solving for years in highly regulated industries like finance. So why wouldn't companies make absolutely sure that the place they're sending a corporate asset like a laptop to is the correct one for the person they think they're hiring?
100%. And
Yeah.
actually, you hit the nail on the head, I think, Adam, because I think if you use verified credentials between the hiring and the onboarding process, right, that credential's been altered and you get a different level of access. But ultimately, you are already in the flow, right? You're not
Yes.
having to say, right, you got the job. Now, by the way, we're going to onboard you. And
Yeah.
now we're going to need 20 more documents.
Yeah.
And we're going to give you other provision access to everything that we have under the sun. Like
Yeah.
this is where for identity orchestration, and this is really I see this really as key component and the glue or the plumbing, if you will, that makes IAM work. It's identity orchestration. You can orchestrate that using
Yes.
an appropriate, verified credential points and nodes and using the appropriate IDV checks. You can then build that into an onboarding journey, and then you can see how it's working. And then once it's in the kind of system, then you can run IGA on it, right? You can see,
Right.
is that
Right.
user over provisioned? Like, do we
Yeah.
need to
What's
like
the
scale
governance
down?
access?
Exactly,
Right.
right? So it kind of all connects because when you think about IDV and IAM and IGA, you bring that all together. There's a whole plethora of capabilities there. And,
Yeah.
big organizations, enterprises, they've got like legions of IAM personnel who are experts and they build
Yeah.
this stuff. But the further that you don't go down market, you have less and less expertise. And so, our customers are reliant on us to give them the tools to be able to build that. seamlessly, right? And
Yes.
this is where we can bring Mitek and Ping together because we have that extensible connectivity and that orchestration that brings us all into an outcome, right?
Yeah, and that orchestration gives you flexibility, right? The same thing that we've been doing for consumers for years. And we'll take finance because we you and I are stuck on that. It's our sandbox. But you think about it, like when somebody goes to apply for a $1,000 entry level credit card because they're a college student and it's low, like that IDV process is usually pretty low on friction. You're still going to run an IDV. You're not just going to give a credit card to anybody, but you're not probably going to check them for PEPs and sanctions. You're not going to do a whole bunch of other really high level assurance things that we can all orchestrate if you need to. But if somebody's going to take out a home loan for $1 million, there's more friction and there are more steps. Hey, we're going to check their credit history. We're going to check a lot of other background information on them. If somebody's going to take out a business loan for $25 million, right? You're definitely going to run PEPs and sanctions checks because you need to make sure, and you're required to for compliance reasons. But you can orchestrate different journeys, so different verifications with different levels of friction based on, what that end user is trying to do or what they're trying to get to. It's the same thing for the hiring process. Again, if you're hiring Adam and I for product marketing, you probably don't need to have quite as much friction. We probably don't have access to too many terrible systems, right? Like I do know where all of the marketing slicks are, but other than that, we're probably good. But again, for somebody like your software stack engineer, yeah, that might be a whole different level of verification that you want to run. And so having the ability to orchestrate and have different levels for each of those, that's something we've been doing for years and years. Why not include that into the hiring process?
Awesome, guys. Yeah, really good stuff. And we're getting a little under 10 minutes. Let me do a couple questions. I want to make sure you guys can deliver some kind of pointed takeaways. And if we have time for other questions, we'll get to those. So, Corey, I have noticed how many acronyms we have, by the way. So Corey's going to throw some more at you guys here. What are the thoughts on having the smart card that uses PKI to securely authenticate users that regulates their scope of authority by a manager or unit security manager like SIPR tokens work? That was kind of a little bit muddled of a question, but if you got that and you can read it, um, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I would say it's ultimately about giving enterprises the choice about how to do that, right? If they want to use that particular mechanism, then great. Like they should be able to. If they want to use MyTech on IDV, great. They should be able to. If they want to use another vendor, great. They should be able to, right? And they should be able to orchestrate that in a single way. So, I mean, when it comes to using cards of that nature. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's we could do that, but ultimately, what we're seeing in the regulated industries is an increasing use of biometrics and IDV, not just at the start of the hiring process, but throughout the entire journey, right? That becomes something that's much more easier to orchestrate and easier to control, and also something that fits into that kind of orchestration journey much more effectively. Again, orchestration being the king here. So yeah, but I don't know if you got perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think earlier when you were talking about digital wallets and we were talking about, being able to issue credentials and things like that, like public and private key, that's one of the technologies that really make digital credentials work. So you can issue a private key from your industry or from your business that's the thing that's required for a certain thing. The individual can have a private key on their smartphone or their device so that you're securing that device. So I think those are, again, all really good tools in the toolkit for making sure, especially on the IAM front, where you're talking about access to systems once somebody is sort of within the corporate firewall. I think those are all really good tools for making sure that you're not allowing somebody to have access to things that they shouldn't have access to. Um, but yeah, I'm gonna be honest. I don't actually know what SIPR tokens are. That was the one that caught me. So I may have to Google that after.
Yeah,
But
same
for
here.
private keys, PKI stuff, that I think is always a really good tool in the toolkit.
I didn't know what PKI was. So, hey, these are acronym bingo. And I think honestly, those are some good insights. So let's do Scott. Scott's more thinking about like, Microsoft Office primarily uses OTP verification. And he's kind of wondering if that's more, they know it's not going to thwart all fraudulent accents just to kind of slow folks down. So maybe just in general, do you think some companies know the vulnerabilities of OTP, maybe haven't dove into something more secure, but they feel like it'll at least slow some of the slower or the yeah, just slow them down.
Well, I mean, I would say on OTP, look, even the most progressive banks still using OTP. I use like a top four high street bank in the UK. They got a very good security model in place, and they still give me the choice to be able to verify via SMS OTP. And sometimes I might do it because I'm in the dark or whatever else, right? So I've got choice. But I am being warned when I do that that that's not a safe mechanism, right? I am being warned by
Yeah.
my bank. You know,
Yeah.
so and also look, I think there's a whole thing here around IM modernization under the hood. Modernizing IM infrastructure is not easy. It takes time. The larger the organization, the more complex infrastructure they'll have, the more legacy they have built in. And yeah, there may be an aspiration, in a CISO's office to move away from SMS OTP. Doesn't necessarily mean that they can achieve that moving from day one to day two. So it's a managed process, right? And I think for me, it's ultimately about bringing more tools and enabling enterprises to have more tools to inject into that kind of hiring and onboarding process that we use in the SIAM space, right? To be able to give them that choice and flexibility and that managed transition, if you will.
Yes.
Nice. We have 4 minutes, so maybe a minute or two for each of you guys to give some takeaways, some practical things. If people only remember one thing or a couple things, what are
Mhm.
those things? And let's start with Adam Basia.
Okay, so I'm going to do this in 2 minutes if I can. So one apiece then maybe. Well, okay. So obviously, number one on my list is going to be, that people do need to start thinking about workforce identity, at least for that remote workforce, like they think about customer identity, right? High assurance, to Scott's comment, is your friend, and your best chance at stopping a bad actor is always going to be at the front door. And then two, right, would be synthetic identities are very real, and again, unfortunately, there's almost no safe data that's out there. So don't just rely on like background checks. The identity that you're checking on may absolutely exist and may have a sterling background and credentials. But are you sure that identity is the actual person that you've been talking to, right? Like, so confirm the identity belongs to the person that you've been interviewing before you check on their employment or credit history. Oh,
Oh,
wait, and one more. Sorry, I got one more. And the other add-on, right? Like plan for AI fraud. And Adam, I'm gonna guess this is probably right on top of his list, but that is a trend that is gonna keep increasing as these generative tools get better and easier and easier and easier to use. So just know that it's not going away. AI-driven fraud is going to increase. That is just real.
Yeah,
wonderful,
exactly.
wonderful.
I mean, to that point, I would just say one key thing here, right? You need to bring a plethora of these capabilities to play into the remote hiring and onboarding process, and that includes, it includes IDM, IGV, it includes access management, it includes identity governance and administration, it includes fine-grained authorization, it includes context-aware threat detection and response. So when you think about all these capabilities, what sits at the core of that is really that kind of access decisioning logic. And at the core of that is identity orchestration. And that really is the glue that brings us all together, and gives those organizations and our customers the ability to be able to choose what's right for them, right? And it enables them to also put things into practice and say, you know what, how is that flow working?
Yeah.
Does the IDV here, does that bounce 80% of the traffic? Is that a
Yeah.
problem? Is my assurance too high? Should I drop
Right.
it? Without that orchestration layer, you have no idea about what you're doing. You're spending months coding it, implementing and deploying, and but so you find out next year it didn't work for you. Well, you got to be more agile in that process, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the one piece of hope too, right? On the whole AI front is that, we're so used to business rules being the thing that sort of regulates how things work, but AI gives us the ability to be a lot more dynamic with the systems that you build to where they can self-regulate and they can adjust, in real time to new threats or changes versus just being, hey, this business rule has been in place for 12 months before we checked it and realized that it's bouncing 80% of our employees before they ever get to the first interview. Huh.
And
Yeah.
that's precisely why a lot of our customers are saying to us, "Hey, how are you going to help us use AI to mitigate the AI risks? We're going to give you AI and inject it into orchestration, right? So Gen AI can
Exactly.
actually give you a lot of signposting, right? And hold your hand for you if you need it to the degree that you want, and then be able to actually figure out what the threats are that you're facing, and then build the journey that is responsive to that, right? So
Exactly.
yeah.
Awesome, guys. We hit noon on the nose. Thank you so much, the Adams, the nicely dressed Adams, for doing all the smart stuff. And thanks for everyone who interacted in the chat and just for showing up, guys. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully it's valuable for you. That's what we aim in all these. And it's been a pleasure just kind of moderating this and learning some things myself. So thanks to everybody. Appreciate you all. And until next time.
Brilliant. Thanks,
All right,
Adam.
y'all.
Thanks, PJ.
Cheers,
Take
guys.
care.
Bye.